A man in my office asked me whether I'm from China. I said yes. Then do you know what he said to me?
Obvious something hurtful?
Yes. He said that the Chinese are so bad because we're spreading the virus everywhere. And now China is going even further to bully Australia.
Oh, that does hurt.
Of course it hurts. I never had anyone speak to me like that before. He's the first. It's the Chinese government who covered up the truth of COVID-19 in the first place, and it's the Chinese government who decided to punish and bully Australia. Why should I be blamed for something I did not do?
Nobody has spoken to me like that either. Maybe he was not clear on the difference between Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, and that the CCP does not represent the will of the Chinese people.
Exactly. But why did Chinese government choose to punish Australia? Did Australia do anything to offend China?
I still prefer the word bully. And it is true that Australia has done something offensive, not to China though, to Chinese Communist Party.
What has Australia done?
Well, to their credit, in November last year, the CCP's embassy in Canberra conveniently summarized 14 of the so-called sins committed by Australia. In the list, the CCP expressed its concern that Chinese investment projects in infrastructure, agriculture, and other industries were rejected by Australia due to national security concerns, that 5G technology providers Huawei and ZTE were banned for the same reason, that Australia introduced foreign interference legislation covertly targeting China, that many Chinese scholars' visas into Australia were revoked, that Australia criticized the CCP for human rights abuses in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and interference in Taiwan, that Australia badmouths the CCP international forums together with other countries including USA, that Australian media often produces reports unfriendly to the CCP, and finally, the worst thing Australia dares to do is to leak the initial proposal for an investigation to the origin of COVID-19.
Wow, that's a big list. But why did our government do these things in the first place? They should have known that by doing these things, the Chinese government wouldn't be happy.
Let me ask you a question. What would you do if your neighbor put their rubbish bins in front of your door and they wanted to know your Wi-Fi password, or they want to come and visit you at 1 o'clock in the morning, and after you eject them, they thought you were rude? If you knew that in your neighbor's family, the husband was beating the wife and the children, and you expressed your concerns to other neighbors and a social worker, but the husband accused you of meddling in their family affairs, and finally, if you found your dog dead in your neighbor's garden, wouldn't you like to investigate what happened? But your neighbor denied you access to his garden and told others that you are in the wrong.
Oh, the neighbor really crossed the line.
It kind of answers your question, why the Australian government did those 14 things to offend CCP.
What did China do?
You mean how did they bully Australia? After the 14 sins were published, a spokesperson for China's Foreign Ministry, Li Jianzhao, tweeted a post with a dotted image of an Australian soldier with a child, which angered the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison. He used uncharacteristically undiplomatic language to get an apology from the CCP, and, of course, none came. Many people expect that at least the tweet would be deleted by Zhao Lijian to show his acknowledgement of Prime Minister's concerns. Yes, and we saw that the tweet is pinned by Zhao Lijian instead, until now. So Twitter has not deleted this post either, but only hidden the image.
Wow, they just don't care about the Prime Minister's concerns.
No, but there was a lot of criticism of the Prime Minister's response from Australians. Critics argue the fierce condemnation of the CCP from some government backbenchers made a bad situation worse. The critics also argue that the Prime Minister's decision to publicly denounce the inflammatory tweet from Zhao Lijian was a misstep. These critics also believe this inappropriate response triggered the Australia-China trade war, but I don't quite agree with that.
The trade war? You mean how the Chinese government has restricted imports from Australia, including barley, wine, cotton, timber, coal, and iron ore, by banning supplies and adding tariffs?
Yes, you have a really good memory. For some products, the tariff is sky high. For example, the tariff for barley is over 80%, and for some wine, up to over 200%. For coal and iron ore, Chinese media outlets have said that the country's top economic planner granted approval to power plants to import coal from overseas without clearance restrictions.
Yes.
Except for Australia.
Oh,
Everyone agrees that the reasons provided by Chinese authorities for these trade restrictions are untrue, such as anti-dumping and anti-subsidy duties for barley and wine, health certificates issues for beef, live pest issues for timber, and new border inspection protocols for lobsters.
sounds like China is looking for bones in an egg, as Chinese would say.
Yes, exactly.
So you just said you don't agree that harsh responses from Prime Minister and some backbenchers triggered the trade war? What do you think the reasons are?
Not just the trade war. The critics also cite other bullying tactics were triggered by the missteps of our government, such as warning Chinese students and tourists not to come to Australia in order to weaken our tourism and international student market. They also began harassing Australian citizens and journalists living in China, some of whom had to leave very quickly.
Oh, so Australia is like a deer caught in the headlights to the growing spate of attacks from China. I read described like this somewhere.
Exactly. Many people wrote articles trying to explain the reasons behind the bullying from CCP. They suggested that China demands respect due to its long memory of humiliation and domination by foreign powers. And Australia's criticism of human rights abuse in China is like another Western humiliation to China.
Oh, that sounds reasonable.
Actually, no. Anyway, they also thought the Prime Minister's responses to CCP's bullying was increasing the temperature of the dispute and it would bring more punishment from China. These groups hold the view that Australia needs to be a gentleman, smiling and talking softly to CCP, and that it is better to put CCP in a cradle singing "We Happy Little Vegemites."
But Australia is not China's grandma.
Good point. I think what Australian government and the Prime Minister did was appropriate and necessary, but it did not trigger the CCP's bullying.
So what do you think the reasons are?
Well, it is common knowledge that bullies only pick on weaker victims, so the CCP must think Australia is a weakening.
Oh, I can't understand that. Australia is only a small country. If you look at the population, the market, and its military power, China does have more muscles.
Many people suggest that China was, and still is, the single biggest driver of the Australian economy. Therefore, China's capacity to cause economic pain on us is much greater than our capacity to cause economic pain on China.
I think that's true too.
But I actually think the CCP picked the wrong one. By the way, Australia is not the only one the CCP bullies. It is clear that the CCP is increasingly aggressive to its neighbors. Japan, South Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, and India have all been bullied by CCP recently.
Like a habitual bully.
The answer is, the CCP is a professional bully. Bullies never pick on stronger foes, at least the ones they think are strong. I will give you 2 examples so we can understand the CCP's bullying behavior more clearly. Firstly, back in 30s and 40s, when the CCP was still weaker than the Chinese Nationalist Party, also called Kuomintang, the ruling party at that time, the CCP kowtowed and promised to submit itself to the leadership of the Nationalist Party. In 1945, as soon as the war against Japan was over, the CCP turning full force against the Nationalist Party, whose power was greatly reduced after fighting the war, and overthrew the government. Secondly, during 2018 and 2020 US-China trade war, the CCP initially used war for warrior diplomacy, tit for tat, and reciprocal countermeasures against the US. The US remained indifferent. Then the CCP utilized a peace treaty strategy, but the US didn't buy that either, and instead, the US sanctioned Chinese and Hong Kong officials for human rights violations. In January 2020, the CCP finally sat down and signed the Phase 1 trade deal, which included significant concessions to protect US technology and trade secrets. That is not all. To prevent the CCP from violating this agreement, the US would continue to impose tariffs on $360 billion worth of goods, along with the threat of future tariffs if CCP rained on its promises.
Wow, China's government definitely know when to step forward and when to step back.
Yes, now we know that CCP is not a spoiled baby. It is a professional bully. It's not new that CCP has bullied Chinese people for over 70 years using lies and violence. Now it is targeting so-called weaker countries around the world, like Australia.
So what do they want to achieve?
Remember the 14 so-called sins the CCP accused Australia of? Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs responded that those are key to Australia's national interests and are thus non-negotiable. So there is an argument that CCP's goal is to pressure Australia into abandoning its national defense structures so that the CCP's nuclear submarines can pass through the water near Australia easily and directly pose a military threat to the United States.
Wow, unbelievable!
Hard to believe, huh? Of course, there are many other arguments about what CCP wants to achieve. Some say CCP wants Australians to show allegiance, obedience, or silence. Some suggest that CCP wants to show Chinese people its power through warrior diplomacy to maintain the legitimacy of their rule in the eyes of the public. We call that Chinese nationalism. Some mention that the CCP simply wants to target US's allies.
The Chinese government has its own agenda.
So now, it's clear that no matter what the responses are, whatever Australia has done, or how the Prime Minister has responded, none of these would matter in the context of the CCP's bullying behavior. In other words, CCP would want to bully Australia regardless, as long as Australia wants to protect its national interests.
I remember Mr. Morrison said, "It's as if Australia does not have its own unique interests or views as an independent sovereign state."
Yes, Mr. Morrison knows the CCP. Some others don't. And we know the Australian government is not backing down. I think it's wise to do so. We know many Australian scholars recommended that we need to reduce the temperature of the dispute with China, and that we need to gesture and play by rules to show our moral authority. These strategies will not work on CCP because we're dealing with a professional bully who does not play by rules or appreciate gestures and who only recognizes the fist and power. Think about it. Have we ever seen the CCP bully North Korea or some thuggish regimes in Africa?
So it is like the Chinese saying, bully the weak and fear the strong. But Australia is weaker than China, so we have to be careful.
Actually, Australia is not weaker than China. As I said before, I think the CCP picked the wrong one. But Australians need to realize that first to make right choice. You might not agree with me, but we can analyze this more next time. To make right choices when dealing with the CCP, I would suggest we need to learn from history to know the true face of the CCP, to join anti-CCP allies, and not harbor any misconceptions about the CCP. But most importantly, to differentiate the CCP from China. China and the world would be much better without the CCP. Are there any more suggestions? Please leave your comments below.
Well, that's easier said than done. I mean, would we start to live a hard life from now on? Would everything be super expensive? Would I lose my job? Would Australia's economy collapse? I'm so scared.
I know, but according to my research, the CCP would experience more pain than Australia, especially in 2021. The strangulation of the CCP would not take long.
Really?
Yes. Let's talk about it next time. Thanks for watching my video today. If you like the video, please hit the like button and please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And please share the link of this video to your social media page if you think the video is somehow helpful. Thanks and see you next time. Bye.